Hey, I wanted to give you guys a look at the premium content, the premium demos that we usually do. These videos are usually exclusive for the premium members, but we wanted to give you a look behind the scenes and hopefully convince some of you to go over and get the full premium course if you're interested in portrait sculpting. Let's get into it. So here you can see that I've built up the forms up to the point where I've established as close as I can the likeness from the front view. I've added some thickness into the cheeks. We've already gone through the steps of building out an armature, getting our references, building a block in, and then adding the bony features on top. We've captured our likeness from the front view, and now we're going to be working around the sculpture and turning the sculpture, looking at it from different angles, looking at our reference from different angles, and trying to establish the forms from every angle. So I'm going to be working more in this video on things like the mouth, the nose, and in part 2 of this demo, I'm going to be focusing more on the eyes. But here you can see I'm just taking little pieces of clay and laying it onto the forms. I've already established that bowed out cylinder, that rounded form of the mound of the mouth or the dental mound, and so I'm able to lay in clay on top of that and quickly build out things like the lips. And here I'm looking at the nostril, building out the nostril. And what I want to pay attention to is laying out the pieces of clay in the direction of the forms. So with the nostril, I'm just laying a piece of clay in that direction, and I want to pay special attention to how far back from that profile line of the face those forms are. Remember on our step of sculpting the profile, we really double checked to make sure that the profile was accurate as we could get it. And so that's what we want to be basing all of our other measurements off of. Here for the eyes, I'm going to do the same thing that we did when we laid out the profile of the face, but I'm going to just do it with the eye. So I'm building up a wall of clay to say, here is the form of the eye, here's the upper eyelid, another piece of clay that shows here's the lower eyelid, and the separation between those two, and the distance back and the position in the eye socket should be accurate for this wall of clay that we're establishing to represent the eye. Then also a little bit of a piece of clay to represent that the bags under the eyes, or the inferior orbital fat pad, which is that fat pad underneath the eyes, the bags of the eyes that we went over in our lesson that goes over the fat pads of the face. And I'm continuing to build out the forms like these fat pads around the mouth, and starting to work on the transitions between the forms, like the transition between the nose and the cheeks, the mouth and the surrounding cheeks and chin. And really what I'm hoping to do at this stage of the process is just move around the whole sculpture and develop things one piece of clay at a time, and just kind of keep trying to push things in the right direction. Starting with the safe areas, with areas where we know, okay, this will need a little bit more clay. When adding clay to areas like that center line of the face, we want to be very careful. I don't want to mess up the center line that I spent so much time establishing. So I'm really careful when I'm doing things like adding a little bit of that brow, that bony feature of the brow onto that center line of the face, because I don't want to undo any of the work that I've done previously. That's something that I made that mistake quite a few times when I did my first portrait sculpture, is that I was too loose with that center line of the face instead of allowing it to be a solid frame of reference. So when I do need to make modifications to that profile of the face, like I'm doing here with the nose, I'm very careful to make sure that it's in line with the accuracy of the portrait with my facial features, and that I'm getting closer and closer to the reference, rather than messing up some of the measurements that I've already laid in place. So here you can see that side of the face before I've made these changes, and then after. This is how I like to go from a rough almost skeletal-like structure to actually starting to build out the forms of the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. And then again, I can turn to the front view, look at it from the front view, from the side view. You can see that I keep turning it different areas because when I lay in a piece of clay, I want to make sure that that piece of clay looks good from the side view, from the 3/4 view, and from the front view to make sure that it's exactly in the right space. And you can do that by turning the sculpture as I'm doing here, or just by standing up and being able to move around your sculpture. If you have an issue with your sculpture feeling a little bit too stiff, then I think standing up just gives a little bit more energy to the sculpture. So if you can be standing while you're working on your sculpture, I think that helps a lot. Here I felt like the ear needed to be pushed back a little bit from the side view of the skull, or from the side view of the portrait, and just adding a little bit more mass into those cheekbones and trying to capture the accurate shape of the ear from this side profile view. And then taking a tool or your thumb and going across the form after you lay in a piece of clay, so laying in a piece of clay in the direction of the form and then coming over it afterwards and smoothing it out in the opposite direction, that can help you smooth out the forms, and it just feels a little bit more lifelike when you have those forms softened a little bit more. So I do that from time to time. I'll lay in a piece of clay along the direction of the form and then come against the direction of the form to kind of clarify exactly what's happening. So laying a piece of clay for the cheek and then, spreading that clay out just with my thumb to smooth things out. And I'm looking at that side view, and I want that cheek to come forward the right amount of fat. I'm thinking about the fat pads and just paying close attention to the reference images from the side view as I'm working on this part of the sculpture. Don't expect any area of the sculpture to be easy, to come together easily. Every area is difficult. If I had to say one area that's maybe the easiest, the nose for me seems to be the easiest facial feature, but even with that, it's still very difficult. Here you can see from the front view and from the side view. From the front view, the nose still needs to build out the thickness quite a ways, but I'm just trying to get the distances back when looking at the face from the center line, or from the side view. That's what I want to establish first. So here I'm just coming in this safe area of the hair and rounding off that form and laying in those pieces of clay to say that there needs to be a little bit more mass here in the hair. And I can be pretty generous with how much clay I'm laying in, just because there still needs to be quite a bit of clay. And again, this 3/4 view is really important. And paying attention to the mass of the back of the head, that doesn't get enough. It doesn't get enough attention in most of the sculptures that I see. People like to pay really close attention to the features of the face, but if the back of the skull doesn't have the right amount of mass in the right areas, then your portrait just won't look right. It'll look really funny and it won't feel right. So take extra care to make sure that you're addressing the sculpture from every angle and addressing the outline of the sculpture from every angle, and make sure that you get enough mass in the back of the head. The beginner mistake, the classic beginner mistake, is not having enough mass in the back of the head. Makes the head look too small and the facial features get too big, just because we realize that the facial features are the most important area, so we tend to want to exaggerate the size in that area, or maybe we spend too much time adding clay in those areas that are more important. But don't make that mistake. Make sure that you're developing the back of the head as well. You can use a knife to come in and draw in guidelines for things like the hairline. Hairline, again, when you're sculpting a specific person, hairline is really important to help you start to capture that likeness. So take some time, look at it from a couple different angles, and make sure that that hairline is looking good especially from the side view. And here I'm just kind of building out the clay in the forms of the skull. You can kind of see that I'm laying in the clay where the bottom of the skull ends, and then there's kind of some muscle and fat that attaches to that. So there's kind of almost like a little bump that represents the skin fold where the skull then attaches to muscle and that area of the back of the neck. So I want to make sure that that is represented as I'm laying in those pieces of clay. And again, drawing in distinctions between muscle groups. Here we have the sternocleidomastoid muscle that goes and attaches behind the ear. And then on me, it's quite soft, so there's not a lot of definition between that muscle and the trapezius muscle that's right behind. That line that I drew in with the knife is just me telling myself, okay, this is the separation that I'm seeing in the forms between the trapezius in the back and the sternocleidomastoid on the side. But the transition between those forms is pretty soft, especially, I have, I'm not super thin, overly thin, and so those forms are going to be pretty soft, softened by fat and skin. So again, laying in clay just to represent, okay, there's a little bit of a bump here where the skull part of the hair transitions to those muscles in the back of the neck. And if you ever lose track of your center line, be sure to go and redraw that. That's really important to keep established throughout the sculpting process. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So just build up these forms one piece of clay at a time. Working, I usually, I'll start developing one side, and then you want to come over pretty soon and establish the symmetry between the other side, because if you work too long on one side, get it too developed, then it's kind of hard to remember exactly how you placed those pieces of clay to build up that form. So I definitely recommend, you'll start working on one side, but then pretty quickly come over to the other side, reestablish the symmetry, and then go back and forth to make sure that you're not leaving any areas unattended for too long, because then when an area gets way left behind, then it's hard to get it caught up to the rest of the sculpture. So it's better to work evenly throughout and just develop the whole sculpture together. That's why I've established these 6 steps, is because it's better to work in a way where you develop the whole sculpture to one step and then move on to the next step, and then develop the whole thing to complete that next step, and then continue on like that, working around the sculpture from every angle according to the step that you're on in the sculpting process. Again, I felt like it needed a little bit more mass here in the back. There you can still see that transition between the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle that goes from behind the ear down to the pit of the neck. Really important muscle for portraiture, probably the most important muscle for when you're sculpting the portrait. And just coming in and softening up these transitions, putting clay in any areas where it's still missing some information. This process probably took 2 or 3 times as long as what you're seeing here. I tried to cut out all of the space in between me laying down pieces of clay, but in between each of those pauses where I put in a piece of clay and then grab another piece of clay and put it in, sometimes I'll be turning the sculpture to look at it from different angles. Sometimes I'll be moving my head around to try to make sure that I'm putting the clay in the right area. And then I'm always bouncing between the reference images and the sculpture and really trying to establish that likeness as best I can from every angle. Here I took a knife and drew in some guidelines for the direction of the hair for that swirl in the back of the head. And I'm trying to make sure that the hair is coming out in the right direction as I'm starting to lay in these locks of hair or forms of hair. And studying the way the hair comes off the head and different sections of the hair, that was really useful and I went over that in the lesson that goes over sculpting the hair and the anatomy of the hair, which is a premium lesson. But it is really helpful to be able to section out pieces of hair and then realize, the direction the forms are flowing. And it just, the more information you're able to absorb as you're sculpting, the closer and closer your sculpture can get to looking like you really understand the portrait and you understand what's going on when it comes to representing the portrait in clay, regardless of the person that you're sculpting, because the principles of anatomy and form and these things will be adjusted from person to person. But when you realize that these areas exist, when you understand the structure of the bones of the skull, then you're able to see, okay, well, how does this person deviate from the average person when it comes to the structure of the skull or the size of the head or the shape of the head or the direction of the hair, the shape of the hair. And the more information you have, just the better off you are when it comes to sculpting anybody. And then also just getting repetition. I think that this sculpture came together way easier than the first one that I did. The first one was life size, and I wasn't as intentional at following the 10 steps as I should have been. So I think partly because of that, and partly because it was just my second time sculpting the portrait, I felt like this one in this brown clay came together way faster. It was way easier. And I felt like the likeness was captured much better than the first one. So here, I'm looking at it from the 3/4 view from kind of behind, and I'm laying in a line of clay to represent the shape of that cheek. And then I can round off from that high point, because I know that there's no hill or wall of clay actually in my face, but just laying out that wall of clay and then softening it by adding pieces of clay around, then softening it to the front view, basically. So I'm softening this roundness over to the front. That's a good way to more accurately capture the shape of the cheeks and the transition to things like the eye socket, the brow ridge, and other areas. Now I'm looking at the sculpture from the front view and trying to get a better representation of the distance between the nostrils and things like that, of how the lip kind of comes and tucks into that nostril. And remember that that bottom part of the lip, the nostrils kind of clamp on to that bottom part of the lip, and that kind of causes the lip to squish under those nostrils, and that's an important thing to have in mind as you're developing those forms. Again, coming around with just one piece of clay at a time, redrawing the center line whenever you feel like you need to, which is as often as it gets messed up, that's when you should redraw it, because it is really important to always be able to look at that center line, realize it's the center line, and then you're able to go back and forth on either side of the nose, just like I'm doing here, and maintain that symmetry that you're trying to keep in place. And the exception to that, is if maybe the face is doing like a really weird expression where one side of the face, something very different is happening. But in general, when you're sculpting a portrait, especially if it's a more traditional portrait, even though the face might be turned or might have some slight expression, generally there's going to be quite a bit of symmetry between both halves of the face. Now I'm just coming up, establishing some of the mass around the mouth, giving a little bit of an indication of my kind of goatee that I had when I was taking the references, and that's something that I feel like will help capture the likeness, because I often, if I do trim my beard, I just trim this side, because this is the goatee is the only area where I seem to be able to grow some hair. So adding that to the sculpt, something I wanted to do. Now adding the eyebrows, paying attention to the shape of the eyebrows from the front view. Then the same thing with the chin. I have a little bit of a cleft chin. So just a little bit of a bump in the middle. And taking little pieces of clay, smaller and smaller pieces of clay, to establish things like that lower lip, the curl of the lower lip. And here you can see I'm moving, I move to the ear, then I come to another area of the hair. So I'm jumping around at this point. This stage is working around the sculpture from every angle. So you'll be hopping around a little bit more. There's no part of the sculpting, there's no step along the steps to portrait sculptor where I say, okay, now sculpt the nose entirely. It's all building on top of the previous step and trying to bring the whole sculpture together slowly as a unified sculpture. And that's really important to keep in mind as you're working, especially on this stage. There might be areas where you want to say like, okay, I have kind of the rough idea of the eye socket, so let me sculpt the eyes completely, like accurately, and make sure that those look really good. But I think you're much more likely to make mistakes and then have to redo all of that work if you jump ahead on some areas of the sculpture without bringing the whole thing slowly together. So I'm just taking my fingers, smoothing out areas. Here there's the part in my hair that I want to establish. There's a transition from the side of the nose to the bottom of the nose. And I'm taking little pieces of clay, coming at it from different angles. And with each stage of the process, I'd say it takes a little bit more time the further along. So the first stage is just collecting the references. You can do that, if you have a friend, just hold the camera. You can do that in a minute, just turning around, getting references of yourself. Then the next stage is building an armature. That can be done in a reasonable amount of time. But with each subsequent stage, it just gets slower and slower, and there's more time involved. The changes become less and less noticeable, and you're using either smaller pieces of clay, or as we move from this stage of the sculpture to the next stage, we're actually going to start using tools. One of the stages is checking yourself, which you should be doing throughout the entire process, but I made it its own step. That'll be the next step of the process. But as far as just the actual sculpting, with each stage of the process, you get slower and slower, making less and less changes to the surface of the sculpture and becoming more and more careful as you're adding, little pieces of clay. And sometimes you do need to make big changes, big modifications, but if you build up the first stages of the sculpture accurately, you won't have to do a ton of that work. Okay, so we're just coming to the end of this one. There is a part B to this, and so that one will be a premium lesson where I'll continue to develop the eyes. I'll work more, just like I've done with the mouth and the nose. I'll be sculpting the eyes and showing you my process for that. Thank you guys. Please check out the full portrait sculpting course if you haven't already. If you're passionate about portrait sculpting, I really think that you'll find it useful and enjoyable. Stay creative, stay productive. Hopefully I'll see you in part 2 of this stage of working around the sculpture.